Greetings. Welcome to the Bible in 3D. This is your host, Andrew. We are in a series entitled Hot Topics. And currently we are looking at a series of episodes that answers the question, is the Bible reliable? Last time, we were finishing up on the internal evidence, of showing that the Bible is reliable. We looked at external evidence and we looked at internal evidence. We're getting it along, and I ended, and so I want to go back and just add a few things about the internal evidence. So external evidence, we look at things like archaeology and contemporary writings written around or near the same time that the writings that we are asking if it's reliable. And again, this is a test that we didn't come up with as Christians. We are using what the secular scholars use to say, is this copy of an ancient document that I am reading, is it reliable? And is it a close or copy of what was actually written many, many years ago? Now, the internal evidence, we said, is what does the document say about itself? The Bible claims to be actual history, written by eyewitnesses. And certainly in the Old Testament, we see that it has prophecies. And we can see later in the New Testament how those prophecies about Jesus Christ came true. Yes, he was born in Bethlehem, and on and on. Let's just look at the New Testament. What does it say about itself? Essentially, it's based on eyewitnesses. Matthew was an eyewitness. He was one of the disciples, apostles. Mark actually was a teenager. He had seen some of the accounts, some of the things that Jesus did. His mother owned the home where the upper room was used for the Last Supper. John Mark was the young man who was there at the Garden of Gethsemane, and when the guards, the palace police, and the Levites went to seek Jesus, they grabbed a hold of this young boy and he ran off into the night naked. That was John Mark. He was a close confidant of the Apostle Peter, and he had been with Paul, didn't care for what was happening that first missionary journey. There was, they got beat up. They had stones thrown at them, and he went home. He said, I didn't sign up for this. But later, he's reconciled with Peter. Peter had been given great grace because he had often fallen, and he was willing to give grace to Mark. And as Peter was aging out, and the early church wanted to record his testimony, you will, of the life of Jesus, not the life so much as the public ministry. Mark was chosen because he had heard all of the sermons that Peter had preached, especially when he was in Rome. And so based on what Peter said in these sermons, Mark wrote his gospel. Luke was not an eyewitness. He was affiliated with the Apostle Paul, and he says in the very beginning of his gospel, he interviewed the witnesses that were still living. So this would have been about 20 years after the resurrection, and whoever was still alive, including Mother Mary, he interviewed. So he is he's reporting eyewitness testimony. He also was present during much of Paul's journey in the book of Acts. So he would have been an actual eyewitness during many of the things in the book of Acts, which he writes about. The epistles or the letters of Paul says right there, I'm writing this, I'm using somebody to copy down what I say, but I'm dictating it. So Paul's letters, he says he's writing it. John's letters, he says, I'm writing it. Same with the Apostle Peter and James, the half-brother of Jesus, and Jude, the half-brother of Jesus. And Revelation, we are told, it was written by the Apostle John. And this is all presented as either eyewitness testimony or someone who interviewed the actual eyewitnesses and wrote it down. Of all of the books of the New Testament, the only one that we don't know who the author is the author of Hebrews. So the internal evidence of the New Testament says eyewitness testimony. So that is very good. And we compare that to say something like the Iliad and the Odyssey. No, these are poems or stories that were written supposedly about the Trojan War between the Mycenaean Greeks and the people of Troy. That's the first book, the Iliad. I believe city, it was actually called Ilium. We use the word Troy. And then the second book is about this fellow Odysseus or Ulysses, who then tries to get home, and it takes him 10 years to get from Turkey back to Greece. I mean, on its face, these are stories. Now, was there a war between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Trojans? Probably so. A German archaeologist, I believe his name was Schliemann, found the city, the burnt, of course, a city of Troy, discovered archaeologically. There were several different layers. And so, he found some good evidence to say, yes, there really was Troy, there really was a war, it really was burnt down. Now, all of the things that happened before and after are made up. I mean, the story about these three goddesses, and they were trying to figure out who was the most beautiful. And so they asked the father god Zeus, okay, which one of us is most beautiful? And Zeus goes, I'm not getting into this question or this problem. So they pick a human, a guy named Paris, who's the son of the king of Troy, and all of the goddesses offer him bribes. He chooses one, carries her off, and supposedly that starts the Trojan War. Well, folks, that's just fiction, and we know that. The Trojan War, the historical event, was part of the great Bronze Age collapse, and it had nothing to do with mythological goddesses and who was the most beautiful. So again, I'm comparing the New Testament, which claims to be true by eyewitnesses who were there, and we can verify some of that in archaeology. I didn't talk about it today. And we can compare that to, say, the Iliad and the Odyssey. By the way, these were written by a blind poet named Homer. Okay, how can a blind poet write? Well, never mind. Apparently, these were oral traditions handed down. And somebody somewhere wrote it down and gave him credit. One of the problems with reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, ancient literature, is that we have many different versions of the Trojan War, the Iliad. We've got at least 3, 4, 5 different versions. Which one is true? Which one is correct? Again, the internal evidence does not support all of the details as being true. Let us now go to the third step in determining if a copy of an ancient document that we have is consistent with how the document was originally written. So the test again, external evidence, internal evidence, and today we're going to look at what is called the bibliographical evidence. If we are willing to evaluate the New Testament like scholars evaluate any other historical document, I'll tell you right up front, there is more evidence to support the reliability of, say, the New Testament than any other ancient document that we have. If you cannot accept the results of this test, then you cannot accept any ancient document or copy of ancient documents that we might have. And I'll come back to that. Now, in this bibliographical step, we look at two things. How close are the existing documents that we have, our copies, to the time of the subjects or the life of the writer? So how close is the date of our documents to the date when these things actually happened? The second thing we look at is, of the oldest existing documents that we have of this particular writing, how many copies do we have of these earliest copies? So No one has the original autograph of any ancient document. They'd long be gone, but they've been copied. So if we look at the earliest copies, okay, what's the time space between the copy, when it was copied and when the events happened, and how many copies of these earliest documents do we have? Earliest copies. Again, there's more proof as to the validity and accuracy of, say, the New Testament than any other document in ancient times. One more time, if we reject the New Testament as valid, then you have to reject all the ancient documents and all ancient history. So with that test in mind, I'm going to throw out some ancient writers, and I'm going to tell you when they were written and the earliest copies we have, and I'll give you the time span, and I'll tell you the number of those early copies that we have. Julius Caesar wrote his commentary on the Gallic Wars. You know, kind of like everybody running for president writes a book when they're running so that you can get the book, their autobiography, and, you know, and that helps you decide to vote for him. Well, Caesar was a general, and he went to Gaul, and there was all these wars going on there. And so he writes about these Gallic Wars, the Romans trying to defeat and conquer all the Gauls. The Gauls would have been, now we're talking Europe. And he wrote this because he wanted to push himself forward. He wanted everybody to know who he was. So he wrote this book, had many copies made, so people who were interested in the Gallic Wars would read it and know that Caesar was the hero. When were they written? Well, Caesar was born about 100 BC, and he was murdered about 44 BC. So, let's say, 60 BC is when he wrote, and the title is Caesar's Commentary on the Gallic Wars. So that was, 60 BC. Do we have copies of that? Well, we don't have the original copy, but we have copies of copies. The oldest copy that we have has been dated to 900 AD. That means Caesar's Commentary on the Gallic Wars, the time span between when it was written and the earliest copies we have is 1,000 years, or pretty close. How many copies that old do we have? 10. Now, as a young boy in high school, I first took Latin. And I have never forgotten this. The opening line in Caesar's Commentary on the Gallic Wars goes something like this. Gallia est omnes in divisa partes tres. So Caesar starts out his book, all of Gaul is divided into three. And then he goes on to name each of the three areas. Nobody doubts that the copy that we have from 900 AD, nobody doubts that it's anything other than a copy of what Caesar himself wrote in, say, 60 BC. Plato, he goes back even further. So Plato lived between 427 and 347 BC. The earliest copy of any of his works. Now, Plato was a philosopher. Many, many things have been written about what he has done, what his writing, what his philosophy was. And if you study philosophy, I mean, this is like square one, this is the guy. Very important than his writings. Everybody read them. The Greeks read them, the Romans read them, the Arabs read them, medieval church, and everybody up through today has read and studied the works of the philosopher Plato. So if the earliest copy, again, is 900 AD, the time span between Plato wrote it and copies that we have that were dated to 900, that's 1,200 years between it when it was first written and the oldest copy. Now we can go on. Tacitus was a Roman historian. He wrote about 100 AD. The earliest copy we have of his work is 1100 AD. So there's another 1,000-year gap. I'm sorry, Plato's works The most that we have that's 1,200 years old, the most copies on any one work is 20 or less. Tacitus, we only have 7 copies of his work. Pliny the Younger, he again was a historian, and he goes back to about that same time period. And we have earliest copy about 1100. So there's another 1,000-year gap, and there's only 7 copies. Thucydides, he was I believe he was a historian, a Greek historian, 460 to 400 BC. The earliest work we have of his is 900 AD, so the time span is 1,300 years, and we only have 8 copies. Suetonius, a historian, and that would have been a Roman, and earliest copy is 950 AD, so there's an 800-year gap, and there's only 8 copies. Herodotus was a Greek historian, and he wrote, contemporary, actually earlier than, say, Plato. So he was 480 to 425 BC. And again, there's about 1,300 years between when he wrote and when our earliest copies, and there's only 8 of them. All right, let's go to Aristotle. Aristotle was 384 to 322 BC. He, Greek philosopher, so much of his thought, and I've talked before about logic and his work in logic, and we still study it today, and absolutely no one doubts that the copy of his treatise on logic is anything different than what he wrote. And the time span between when he wrote and our earliest copies in 1100 AD is 1,400 years. And of all his works, we only have onesies, twosies. The most copies we have of any of his works is 5. And yet nobody in history and in philosophy, by the way, I think I said Sophocles was actually a playwright, and he wrote Greek tragedies. So whether you're talking about a playwright, philosophy, history, these time spans are, 1,000 years or more from the copies we have that are dated to when they were written. And typically we have maybe 7 or 8. And in the case of Plato, maybe onesies, twosies, and at the most 5. Now let's talk about the New Testament. New Testament, again, was written between about 50 AD to about 98 AD. If everything disappeared, we have manuscript evidence, copies of letters, writings by the early church fathers. So this would be within 200 years, 2 generations rather, not 200 years, two generations of the resurrection. So between 35 and 120 AD, we have copies of writings by the church fathers. In fact, in seminary, I had to read a letter that was written by one of these church fathers to one of the early emperors to say, you shouldn't persecute us. We're good citizens. And it's a very interesting read. Why am I telling you this? Because the early church fathers quote the New Testament. We can reconstruct the entire New Testament based on the quotes in all of these early church fathers. And that was between 35 and 120 AD. We have copies of their stuff. 120 AD, we have what's called the John Rylands manuscript. Right? It was found in Egypt. It is a small portion of the Gospel of John. Okay, the Gospel of John was written in the 90s AD. The John Rylands manuscript is dated about 120, 125 AD. What are we talking? 30 years? We have an actual document. It's not the complete Gospel of John. It's in the latter portion, chapter 4 in particular. And it's dated to 120 AD. It's within 30 years of when John wrote it. Where was John when he wrote it? He was in Ephesus, which was in Turkey. And here is a copy that we can date It was done 30 years later, and it's all the way across the Mediterranean, and it's in Egypt. There is no other ancient document that can do this kind of stuff. All right, now we go to 200 AD. We have what's called the Chester Beatty Papyrus. We have the Bodmer Papyrus. We have P67 fragment. Now, the Chester Beatty Papyrus contains major portions of the New Testament, and it is dated to just a little after 200 AD. These other two, the Bodmer Papyrus is actually a major portion of the Gospel of John, and the P67 fragment is portions of the Gospel of Matthew. Again, these documents were written between 50 and 70 AD, and the copies that we have that we can put our finger on in the museum were written about 200, so maybe 150 to 170 years after. All right, now we get into the heavy lifting. We have a complete and separate translation of the New Testament, which is dated about 325 AD. It's called the Codex Vaticanicus. So here is a document, the complete New Testament, that is maybe 200 years after all these things were written, a complete copy. The next complete copy that we have is called the Codex Sinaiticus, and they date that to 350 AD. Again, a complete translation of the New Testament. Now let us go and say, starting about 400 AD, right around 400 AD, and shortly thereafter, we have a little less than 6,000 complete Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. During that time, we also have 8,000 copies of the New Testament that were translated into the Vulgate Latin. This is the Latin Vulgate translation. And it was written by St. Jerome in the 300s. The New Testament Greek was, during this time, after 400 AD, translated into Syriac, Aramaic, Coptic, Armenian, Gothic, Ethiopian. And we have over 19,000 copies. Now, these are not Greek, but they were translated from the Greek within a few hundred years of when they were originally written. So if we say, is the New Testament reliable? Well, by the test, the bibliographical test that these secular scholars use, what's the distance between, time-wise, between when it was written and the copy that you have, okay? And how many copies are there? Folks, we can get down to 30 years for portions. And to get a complete section of the New Testament, we're probably talking 200, 250 years max. And within 300 years, we have almost 7,000. Okay. No other ancient document can claim the reliability that the New Testament does. And from here, it only gets more exciting. Just to summarize now, the external evidence, the archaeology, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the contemporary writings during the New Testament, the historians that mention Christ and the Christians, show the reliability of the Bible. The internal evidence, what the New Testament, what the Bible claims for itself. Eyewitness history, prophecy, and we can show the prophecy is actually fulfilled in the New Testament. And it's written, especially the New Testament, by people who tell you who they are. And they were real people. So we have eyewitness statements. And now we use the bibliographical test. And it's an embarrassment of riches. There is so much evidence to show that the copies that we have reliably identify and are the same as the ones that were originally written. I hope this gives you encouragement. I will make sure that I have some written pages out there. And if this is something that's interesting to you and you would like maybe, my full text, where you could sit down with somebody and say, well, let me talk to you about the the John Ryland manuscript, or this or that, and you'll blow people away. First time I heard it, I just was like, oh my gosh. All right, with all that in mind, let us go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you for the written word. We thank you for the proof that have kept alive for us to find, to encourage us in our faith. We thank you in Jesus' name.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Bible in 3D. We're so grateful for listeners like you. Your encouragement helps us create and share more transformative content that strengthens communities worldwide. If this episode inspired you, consider supporting our nonprofit mission with a donation at cogrooksmedia.org. Also, be sure to check out our other podcast, Biblical Reflections, for more faith insights. God bless.